Well, welcome, Kyle. We're delighted to have you here today. And Sam and I are really eager to talk with you about your recent book. Sam has it, I think, in hand. There we go. Navigating Reformed Identity in the Rural Dutch Republic. So we're going to take in turn to ask you a few questions. And, if you want to just add things as you go from based on your research and your experience, that would be wonderful. So let's start by just having you tell us what led you to write this book. What kind of lay behind your desire to cover this particular topic?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and I have long appreciated the Media Center and its work. And part of the story about this book uh, is connected to my doctoral program. So I worked at the University of Iowa with Ray Menser. And so he, of course, has done so much with consistory records. So that in my doctoral program, I worked with consistory records as well. And he does the French records, of course, and I am interested in the Dutch records. But that common link has been a part of my career now for over a decade, actually. And so in my first book and project dissertation as well, I was looking at records, consistory records, classis records, provincial synod records concerning the Sabbath and Sabbath observance. And one of the things I noticed when those complaints would come up about Sabbath observance is that fairly frequently they would mention something about the rural lands. It's in Dutch, the platteland, that there was Sabbath desecration in the rural lands. And in that project, I didn't necessarily, was able to delve a little bit into, okay, what's unique about the rural areas, what complaints are they having about this rural context in particular. But there was more, I thought, there. So the Sabbath, like trying to explore the ideas of desecration in rural areas, but then led me to think more about what other parts of religious life in these Dutch Reformed rural contexts are unique. What sort of challenges do they have? What sorts of things what might their experience be like in ways that are similar or different from the urban centers in the Low Countries?
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And it's an area that is perhaps being opened up, but only slowly, just because of access to the materials, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, like, if you look at some of the historiography, most of the work's been done on urban areas, and that's partly because the Low Countries has been sort of held up as the model of urbanization in the early modern period. And that's certainly true, but I still, in the book, I try to argue in the early pages to say, look, for most of the 16th and 17th centuries, most people are still living in rural context. So even though it's urbanizing quickly, and more so than other places in Europe, the rural lands are still where the majority of Reformed Christians are, right? And yeah, you're right. The other issue is it's just harder to access those records. And so it takes, it takes more work to delve into those rural areas oftentimes.
Well, that actually segues nicely into the next question, which were what were the main challenges as you did this work?
Yeah, so the sources is one of the major ones, and that's it's not necessarily a question of number of sources. There's plenty of rural consistory records out there. In fact, I have a whole bunch more that I'll be continuing to work with, but oftentimes access to those. So some of them are being digitized, but a lot of them aren't yet. A lot of them are housed, not at the National Archive in Amsterdam, but are in The Hague and other places. But they're in the more provincial places. So you have to go to different towns, right? And so for this book, I was in Zeeland and Middelburg and in Arnhem and places like just so you have to travel around a little bit. And oftentimes the actual records are in worse physical shape too. They haven't been preserved as well. And the paleography, deciphering the handwriting is, I mean, for any of us, I think it's just a continual challenge. But oftentimes in the rural context, the scribes aren't as good because they're not as well trained. And so their handwriting is even worse. There's more turnover for scribes. So even the paleography is always a challenge for me. But in the rural records, it was sort of even more so. So that was one major challenge. And yeah, was able to overcome some of that. There were times where the consistory records I just couldn't read them. I just couldn't. And so I had to sort of let them go, which is not a fun feeling for a historian. Probably the other major issue, and is the issue of scope. So because there are so many sets of consistory records out there in rural contexts, trying to make decisions about which ones to look at, how many to look at, and when do you sort of draw a line and say, look, I have all this stuff. Now it actually has to come out in a publication. And so I made my decisions, and said, hey, look, I think there's enough here to be helpful. But I can imagine where someone might read it and say, hey, what about all the consistory records in place, Groningen, for example? I know there's consistory records there. And I just didn't include them in this. So trying to determine the scope of it, the sort of methodological issue that I tried to work through.
Yeah, parameters is always tricky, right? What
Yeah,
are your parameters? And then what if someone else says, well, there could have been different parameters? You think, great, you do the project then.
exactly. Yes. If nothing else comes of this, maybe someone will say, hey, I'm going to do this. And I would be very happy about that.
Absolutely. There's more than enough for everybody, right? This is a
Exactly.
good thing. Sam, I'll
Amen.
hand over to you for a few questions.
So, Kyle, I want to ask you, what are the main conclusions from your study?
Yeah, I think there's three main things that I hope come through relatively clearly. And maybe the first one's the most obvious, but I do think is important, is that rural religious experiences are actually unique, and they don't necessarily just mirror urban experiences, actually. And so, in the book, I talk about like nominating and electing elders and deacons. Well, the challenges of finding elders and deacons is a different challenge in a small congregation where the pool is just much, much smaller than it is in an urban church that might be larger. The same thing is true for, how do Christians live together? How do Protestant Reformed Christians live in a small town that have Catholics or Anabaptists? And you can't, in a city, you can sort of keep to yourself a little bit more. You can have your different parts of town or whatever. But in the rural areas, I think that's harder to navigate. And so they have to adopt strategies. So there's all these different ways, I think, that need to be teased out more fully about what's unique about religious experiences in rural areas. And to note that those are important, that simply because those people don't show up at the Synod of Dort or they don't write big works of theology, that their lives actually still matter. And so I think that that's something I hope people take away. Probably the second thing that I would highlight is, and this is characteristic of some of my previous work too, is trying to navigate the interplay between theology and practice, and the ways in which those things are both mutually enforced, but also sometimes contradict each other. And so trying to figure out and explore in more detail to try and say, look, here's the theological idea about the Sabbath, or about elders and deacons, or about how we think about church order, but on the lived level, how are those expectations met, not met, altered, and how does the rural experience fit into that? And so I think, again, it's a sort of obvious point that, look, people's theology doesn't always match their lived experience, but I try and tease that out in more detail to say, here's an example of, look, in rural areas, they just weren't as concerned about Sabbath observance, or at least their theology of Sabbath was different, so that they could adapt their practices in different ways. And then probably the last conclusion would be to say that the rural Christians, the rural Dutch Reformed Christians, were not simply passive recipients of their tradition, but they were active participants who would exercise their own agency. They were capable of, so for example, I've stumbled on this example of a church order that this individual consistory comes up with. They don't just want to accept what Dort comes up with or what their provincial synod comes up with. They want to draw from that maybe, but they want to adapt it to their own context. And they have no problem doing that. And that comes up in other places too. If they want a schoolmaster, they're going to advocate for themselves. And even if the classis says, look, you don't need one yet, or you can't afford one yet, they're going to exercise their agency and try and pursue that.
Yeah. And I've seen that actually in my research as well. It's fascinating how we make assumptions maybe, and certainly people at the time made assumptions perhaps about people in the rural areas being less able and less, just prone to superstition or whatever else. And you find
Yeah.
that actually, no, they're pretty much, they may not use the same language, but they have some pretty clear ideas about theology and where they see their agency in matters of faith. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories that I include in the book that I came across was these Anabaptist women are in front of the consistory, this rural consistory, and the consistory makes this note about, I forget the exact language, but about how the women were defending infant baptism, and they were making a very good argument. So like, yeah, even these Anabaptist women who you might presume to be sort of uneducated or not really know their theology actually know what they're doing, and they're able to cite scripture passages, and they are able to make those arguments. Yeah.
Yeah. That point is somewhat related to my next question about the adaptability of these communities and how they sort of elaborated on the past tradition, as it were. So for me, especially as the curator of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies, it was really interesting to see how often you try to connect Calvin's thought with the with those Dutch Reformed communities. And you also note in the book, in a few incidents, that Calvin's influence should not be overstated, which I agree. So what about then is the appropriate way to measure Calvin's influence on the Dutch Reformed communities? How was he seen, and how much did they rely on him? What were the points of disagreement?
Yeah, I think this is a ongoing question because I think it's a challenging one. So, of course, if people are familiar with the historiography of this, like, Richard Muller's shown pretty clearly that, look, not every people didn't just fall into line with Calvin, that part of not just the Dutch Reformed tradition, but the Reformed tradition more broadly, these theologians were crafting their own ideas, and they, had their own uniqueness to them. So that part of the story, I think, is fairly well, like, you can just go read his articles and he'll show you that really clearly. But in the Dutch situation, I think one of the ways that I see the continuing influence throughout the 16th and even into the 17th century of Calvin and his program in Geneva and his theology is through the educating of pastors. And so Corinne's done, trace this out really well. So you can go read her book about this. But to say, look, these pastors are going to Geneva to be trained, and then they're going to other places, including in the Low Countries. And so you get that sort of direct influence there. But then that does continue on, right? And so there's early guys who get sent out of Geneva and they go maybe to France. And so maybe one place where I'd say, let's not overemphasize Calvin, is to say, not everyone in France loved Calvin. There's been some recent work done on that by Michael Bruning. But those guys who are in France, they're coming, then they're, of course, coming up to the Low Countries. So Calvin's influence comes that way. Later on, it starts to come, I think, more directly through Heidelberg and through, again, more education of pastors, where people are being educated in Heidelberg and coming to the Low Countries. And then even if you were to look at people who are sort of staffing the universities in the Low Countries, so at Leiden, most famously, of course, so many of them still have connections back in, if you trace the sort of intellectual heritage, back to Geneva, back to even Calvin or his followers. So that's one way. The other way is, of course, to look at just the references, right? And to say, when they're doing theology, who are they referencing? And there you do see people referencing Calvin a lot, but not always favorably. And so sometimes there are theologians who say, well, Calvin said this, but that's not right, or we shouldn't rely too much on Calvin here. And this is where I think people like Bullinger were really influential as well. You see him referenced a lot. So to recognize that they are drawing from other sorts of traditions or other people within the Reformed tradition as well. In terms of the theological ways I see this playing out in the rural areas, probably the main one that I would highlight is the reliance on the Genevan church order, or the way in which Calvin thinks about those offices. And that comes, again, through a variety of different ways. It comes through Johannes Alasko and McCrone in Emden and places like that. But the rural churches, and I think the urban ones as well, for the most part, just replicate that sort of church structure in many ways. So, and their church orders are often reflective of that. The Catechism is probably the other most obvious place where, look, the Heidelberg Catechism is really important in rural areas as well. Sabbath observance and afternoon preaching and catechism preaching, and that the Heidelberg Catechism is the primary one, but it is, I think, pretty obviously influenced by the Genevan Catechism as well. But again, that's not to say there's not opposition. You have in the Low Countries the libertine movement. Ben Kaplan's done work on that, and those, people within those movements are clearly opposed to Calvin's ideas on government, things like covenant. They want a nuance, and of course that will come to a head in the Low Countries with the Synod of Dort and the ways in which they're going to, they're not all of one mind, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering a little bit, it's a sort of question of impact. I mean, here you are, an American, doing research in the Netherlands, and I was wondering, in terms of Dutch Reformation studies, what do Dutch colleagues think of you turning up wanting to highlight the rural areas? Is this something that they're like, wow, where did that come from kind of feeling, or is there interest? I mean, how do
there
people
is
respond to
interest. I think there's interest. There are some Dutch scholars who have done work on rural areas, but it's mostly almost all in Dutch. And so that becomes a barrier for a lot of people. And so the works aren't just as well known as probably they should be. In fact, I came across this secondary source that I didn't include in the books. I didn't know about it maybe a month or two ago. And so there are those things out there, but they're not often given the sort of due I think that they probably should be. And so I think on the one hand, they're like, every once in a while I get, well, we've done some of this already, so you're not that, original, which is a good thing to know and good thing to note. But I do think for the most part, they are very encouraging, and they're glad to have people shed more light on the Dutch experience and the Dutch Reformed experience. Especially when I show up at the rural archives and they've not had anyone for a long time wanting to look at church records. They're not even sure they have them, except now the online databases are pretty good. But so they tend to be really appreciative of people shining a light on their past, or what they might identify as their past.
I saw that too, where there was sort of an antiquarian interest in certain areas where you get the history of a family or something like that. It was very true in France. But when you try to shed light on, okay, so what does this mean more generally? What can we learn from this all told? That's a whole different kind of analysis. And that was really fascinating.
Yeah. And I think for so many just average Dutch people now, right, they're increasingly sort of religious, or they have questions, and they're not necessarily tied to any Christian tradition, more or less the Reformed tradition. So for them to try and see the ways in which the religious traditions in the past had shaped their political contexts and their economic contexts, I can't do all that work in this book, but I think they can start to see, oh, this might have been more important for our communities certainly than it is today, maybe. But even then I realized it was in the past. Yeah.
Which is great, which is really helpful.
Yeah.
So what are you working on next? Like, where are you going next?
Yeah, so there are more rural consistories that I'm trying to sort of work on. I haven't been able to get to the Netherlands real recently, so but some of them are online. So there's some from, I mentioned Groningen already. Zwolle has some as well, and so I've been trying to work through those and figure out sort of what they're concerned about, and what, if they're sort of affirms the sorts of things that I've found, or if they're geographical differences. So most places I looked at are in the southern parts of the Dutch Republic. So I'm very interested in experiences in places, like Groningen or Gelderland and places like that. So that will continue on. I'm doing some presenting at the 16th Century Conference on that, with some other great folks, a guy doing Polish Reformed communities and English communities. So that will be great. And then the other sort of strand that I picked up, this also actually came out of my work on the Sabbath, was when I was reading the commentaries and things like that on the 10 Commandments. I would go on then often to read about the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother. And I was really surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, but was surprised to see the ways in which a lot of the Dutch Reformed theologians would sort of expand that to say, well, this isn't just about fathers and mothers, it's also about all authority. and then slaves and masters, or servants and masters. And so that's a pretty hot topic in Dutch Reformed history and in just Dutch society more broadly. So I am trying to tease out, I don't think anyone's quite gone back far enough actually in the discussions of how Dutch Reformed theology thinks about slavery, but even just master servant relationships and authority, and how those theologically, how those things were thought about. So I've been doing quite a bit of work on that as well, trying to sort of set the stage so that in the 17th century, when the Dutch get more active in the slave trade, that maybe we can better understand some of the theological backing and the ways that impacted how they participated. So those two strands are the things I'm sort of, that I'm working on now.
I think that sounds fascinating and something for us to look forward to as you carry on. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyle, and we wish you well for your ongoing research, and we look forward to our continued contacts with you at the Meter Center and at other events as we go forward. So thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity.